A man walks into a crowded bar in occupied France. He doesn't order a drink. He doesn't sit down. He crosses the room, stops beside a table, and fires once into the head of the man sitting there. Nobody turns around. Nobody screams. The record on the gramophone doesn't even skip. Glasses keep clinking 2 tables over. He walks back out through the same door he came in. By the time anyone at the next table notices the man beside them isn't moving, he's 3 streets away and gone. The gun that did this weighed under a kilogram. It looked like a length of pipe. It had no maker's name stamped anywhere on it, no serial number a factory would admit to, because officially it was never made. This is the story of a pistol with exactly one job. Not to win a firefight, not to arm an army, to kill once, without a sound loud enough to turn a head, and then disappear, along with every trace of who fired it and where it came from. By 1942, Britain's Special Operations Executive had a growing problem across occupied Europe. They'd spent 2 years building networks of resistance fighters, saboteurs, and agents dropped by parachute into hostile territory, and those people needed to remove threats without starting a manhunt. A sentry outside a rail yard, a collaborator feeding names to the Gestapo, an informer sitting 3 feet away in a bar full of witnesses. The pistols they had for this didn't work. Standard sidearms with silencers bolted onto the barrel afterward were louder than anyone wanted to admit, and in a quiet street at 2 a.m., quieter than normal still gets you caught. Worse, the mechanics gave you away before the shot even mattered. A semi-automatic slide slamming forward and back, a spent casing hitting cobblestones with a metallic ring, loud enough to turn heads 2 rooms away. You could suppress the bang. You couldn't suppress the machine making it. And even if the shot itself stayed quiet, the gun in your hand didn't lie about where you got it. There was a second problem underneath the first one, and it mattered just as much. These weren't soldiers on a battlefield with an army behind them. They were single agents, often alone, often barely out of their teens, holding together entire resistance cells on nothing but trust and silence. One loud gunshot didn't just risk one life, it risked every name that agent knew, every safe house on their route, every person who'd sheltered them for a night. That was the real problem, and it was bigger than noise. An agent caught carrying British-made equipment wasn't treated as a prisoner of war. There was no rulebook protecting them. Capture meant interrogation, and interrogation meant every name they knew eventually came out. A weapon with a traceable serial number, a factory stamp, anything linking it back to London, wasn't just a death sentence for the person holding it. It was physical evidence the Nazis could put on a table and use to justify what came next, for the agent and for the people around them. That price would turn out to be very real. And later in this story, it's the reason a plan built partly around this gun gets canceled before it can happen. They didn't just need a silent gun. They needed a gun that, if it was ever found, told the enemy absolutely nothing. If you're into history told through the object instead of the general leading the battle, stay close, because the way this problem got solved is stranger than the killing itself. And it starts in a place that doesn't look like a weapons lab at all. Nobody in the regular British arms industry was building anything like this, because nobody sane designs a weapon whose main feature is erasing its own origin. So the job went somewhere the regular arms industry didn't reach. A requisitioned country house north of London called the Frythe, home to a unit so secretive its official name was itself a cover story. The Inner Services Research Bureau. Everyone who actually worked there called it Station 9. Station 9 didn't build rifles or tanks. It built the strange, deniable tools that never showed up in a standard quartermaster's catalog. Things closer to a magician's kit than a soldier's. A motorbike that folded small enough to jump out of a plane. with sabotage devices disguised as lumps of coal, gadgets meant to live in a spy's coat pocket rather than a rifleman's pack. Every project that came out of the place carried the same quiet prefix, borrowed from the name of the village just outside its gates. Well, the man handed this particular assignment was an engineer named Hugh Reeves. His brief wasn't design a pistol. It was closer to a contradiction dressed up as a work order. Build something that can kill a man standing an arm's length away, make almost no sound doing it, survive being dropped by parachute into a farmer's field, and leave behind nothing, if it's ever picked up by the wrong hands, that proves it belonged to anyone at all. Reeves didn't start by designing a gun. He started by designing the silence, and everything else got built around that one decision. Silence isn't one problem. It's 4 problems stacked on top of each other, and Reeves had to solve all 4 inside the same few inches of metal. The first was the easiest to state and the hardest to admit. Almost every pistol on Earth is built to be loud, not on purpose, but as a side effect of how it cycles. A standard semi-automatic fires, then a spring slams the slide backward to eject the spent casing and load the next round, then slams it forward again to seat it. That's 2 hard metal impacts per shot on top of the gunshot itself, plus a brass casing bouncing off whatever's underfoot. Screw a silencer onto the end of that barrel, and you've muffled exactly 1 part of a 4-part noise. The other 3 are still happening, so Reeves cut the machine out of it. The well rod doesn't cycle itself. It's bolt action, the same basic mechanism as a hunting rifle, worked by hand. Pull the bolt back, and a spring pushes a fresh round up from the magazine. Push it forward, and the round seats in the chamber. Pull the trigger, and the only thing moving is a firing pin striking a primer. No slide slamming, no casing ejecting mid-cycle to clatter on the ground. The spent case stays locked inside the action until the shooter chooses to open it, quietly, on their own time, somewhere no one's listening. That decision alone removed most of the noise a normal pistol makes that has nothing to do with the bullet. What was left was the gunshot itself, and that's where the second decision comes in, the one most people get backward. The well rod wasn't a pistol with a silencer screwed onto it afterward. The silencer was the pistol. The barrel sat inside a wider tube packed with metal baffles, a dozen of them, stacked in groups and separated by discs of leather. Every time the bullet passed through, the expanding gas behind it had to fight its way through that maze instead of blasting straight out into open air. By the time what was left of the noise reached open air, most of the energy behind it was already gone. The number that came out of testing still sounds made up, around 73 decibels. That's quieter than a hand clap. Press the muzzle directly against a target, and both the mechanism and the report disappeared into something closer to a cough than a gunshot. The third decision was about what happened when nobody was shooting at all, because most of the well rod's life wasn't spent firing. It was spent being carried, hidden, and looked at. Take the magazine out, and there was no trigger guard, no grip, nothing that read as a weapon at a glance, just a smooth metal tube about a foot long, roughly as wide as a length of pipe. Slide the magazine back in, wrapped in a textured rubber sleeve so a hand slick with sweat could still hold it, and it became the grip. 2 pieces of ordinary-looking hardware that only turned into a gun once you put them together. And nowhere on any of it was a name. No manufacturer's stamp, no factory mark. Nothing that would tell an interrogator which country built it, which unit issued it, or who to go looking for next. A serial number existed, but it lived in a British ledger, not on the metal itself. Accountability for the people who issued it, invisible to anyone who captured it. None of this came free. A bolt-action pistol you have to cycle by hand isn't fast. There's no second shot waiting the instant you need one, only the shot you already fired and a half second of working the bolt while whatever's left of the element of surprise runs out. and the suppressor that made it whisper quiet also cost the bullet most of its velocity. This was never meant to be aimed across a room. It was built for a target close enough to touch, hit exactly once at exactly the right distance, or not at all. Every other pistol designer in 1942 was chasing the opposite set of numbers: more rounds, more range, faster follow-up shots. Reeves threw all of that away on purpose. Rate of fire, stopping power at distance, speed of reload. None of it mattered if the job was one shot at close range and a clean walk away afterward. He wasn't building a weapon that could win a fight. He was building one that made sure there was never a fight to begin with. Kill once and vanish. Both the shooter and the gun leaving no more trace behind than a closing door. On paper, it's elegant. A machine, with every unnecessary noise engineered out of it and nothing on its body to connect it to the people who made it. But paper doesn't shake in the dark of a farmhouse before dawn. Paper has never had to walk up to a stranger at arm's length and pull a trigger for the first time in its life. That test was still coming. Go back to that bar in occupied France for a second, because it's not a dramatization. It's a documented account, one of the only field stories about this weapon that survived the war on paper at all. A member of the French resistance walked in, shot an informer at point-blank range in a room full of people, and walked back out unrecognized, unstopped, and, as far as anyone in that bar could tell, uninvolved. Not because he was lucky, because the gun did exactly what it was designed to do. That's the part that's easy to say and hard to actually picture. A killing in public that nobody in the room registered as a killing until it was already over. This is also, as close as the record allows, the answer to the question the last part ended on. It worked. Not in a lab, not on a controlled range, but in the one setting that actually mattered. A crowded room, real risk, no second take. The well rod didn't stay a one-off story. Starting in 1943, crates of them went out by parachute across occupied Europe, dropped to resistance networks in Denmark, in the Netherlands, in France, as far east as Albania, and reportedly as far away as Manchuria, wherever SOE and its American counterpart had people working behind enemy lines. The jobs were almost never dramatic. A guard posted at a bridge the sabotage team needed to cross that night. A watchman at a railway junction due to be blown at 2 a.m. A collaborator who'd been quietly feeding names to the Gestapo and needed to stop before he fed one more. One shot, close enough to touch the target, and the mission behind it kept moving without anyone upstream ever knowing exactly what had happened at that bridge, or why the guard never called it in. That was the small, grinding, unglamorous version of what this pistol was for. Then, in the summer of 1943, someone decided to try something much bigger. A year earlier, 2 SOE-trained operatives had ambushed and killed Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most senior architects of the Nazi occupation, on a street in Prague. The operation worked. What came after it didn't feel like a victory to anyone who lived through it. The Nazi response wasn't a manhunt for soldiers. It was the annihilation of an entire village. Every man killed. The town wiped off the map as a message written in the clearest language the occupation had. For every official you take from us, we will take 100 people who had nothing to do with it. That lesson was still fresh when planners drew up something far larger a year later. A single coordinated wave of assassinations, hitting German officers, officials, and Gestapo agents simultaneously across occupied Europe, all in the same window, with the well rod positioned as one of the primary tools for carrying it out. On paper, it was the weapon finally being used at the scale it was built for. It never happened. The same reprisals that followed Heydrich's death were the reason the plan got shelved before a single target was hit. Nobody could guarantee the retaliation wouldn't be another Lidus repeated across a dozen towns at once. and no intelligence service was willing to sign off on that trade, no matter how effective the weapon behind it had proven to be. So the Welrod's biggest moment on paper is also the mission it never got to carry out. Its actual legacy was built the quieter way. One bridge guard, one informer, one collaborator at a time. Across years, nobody was keeping a public tally of. Across the Atlantic, the Americans were paying attention. When U.S. military evaluators got their hands on a Welrod to assess it, they came back with a rare verdict for anyone building weapons in wartime. Don't bother designing your own. The British had already solved this problem better than anyone else was going to. That's not a small thing to admit. This was a country about to become the world's largest arms producer, and its own engineers looked at somebody else's tube of metal and concluded there was nothing left to improve. The American OSS adopted the Welrod as is, and a batch were even produced on U.S. soil, built fittingly by a company that normally made pumps. What doesn't exist is a full accounting of everywhere this thing was actually used. That was the entire point of building it the way Reeves did. A weapon engineered to leave nothing behind, used by people trained to say nothing about what they'd done, doesn't leave much for historians to work with afterward. What survives is fragments. A bar in France, a canceled operation, a factory in Texas. Pieces of a much longer story that mostly stayed exactly as silent as the gun itself. But the war it was built for wasn't the only one it would end up in. Here's a strange detail that tells you almost everything about how secretive this program actually was. Nobody can agree, even now, on how many Welrods were built, or which version came first. Before either of the numbered versions existed, there was a rougher prototype in the second half of 1942, chambered in .32 ACP, fed by a 5-round magazine, loaded from the top with a conventional bolt handle rather than the sleeker knurled knob that later versions used. It worked well enough to prove the concept, and Station 9 moved straight into production versions almost immediately, because there wasn't time to spare on polishing. You'd expect the Mark I that followed to be the original and the Mark II to be the upgrade. That's how it works on every other piece of military hardware ever numbered. The Welrod runs backward. The version labeled Mark II, chambered in .32 ACP, fed by an 8-round magazine borrowed from an old Colt design, was actually the earlier one, rushed into production first because occupied Europe needed something in agents' hands immediately. The Mark I came later, rebuilt around the more powerful 9mm round, a 6-round magazine, and added trigger guard, a redesigned sight. The second version predates the first version by roughly a year. Even the paperwork on this weapon was built to confuse anyone reading it. Production started in 1943 at the Birmingham Small Arms Factory, then spread to other plants as demand grew. The official wartime figure that gets cited most often is around 2,800 units. But talk to different historians and you'll get different totals. Some push the number, once you count every post-war batch and export order, as high as 14,000. Nobody's lying. There just was never a single ledger anyone was allowed to keep. A weapon engineered to erase its own paper trail did exactly that, even to the country that built it. And that paper trail doesn't stop in 1945. By most accounts, Welrods stayed in active use for decades after the war they were built for was already over. American Special Forces reportedly carried them through the Cold War. The 39th Special Forces Detachment, stationed in Berlin with orders to operate behind enemy lines if the standoff with the Soviets ever turned hot, was issued them for exactly that scenario. In Vietnam, they reportedly turned up with American MACV-SOG teams running reconnaissance deep in hostile territory. The same close-range, no-noise logic that built the gun in the first place, just applied to a different jungle. The British, who never really put it down, are reported to have used it again during the Falklands War in 1982. and it's tied to the long, grinding secrecy of the Troubles in Northern Ireland around the same period. The last publicly reported operational use puts a well rod in the field as recently as the 1991 Gulf War, nearly 50 years after Hugh Reeves first sat down to design one. Caches of them have also surfaced in weapon stockpiles connected to Operation Gladio, the network of secret NATO-linked stay-behind cells scattered across Cold War Italy, stashed in case the continent ever needed an underground resistance again. None of this comes with the kind of documentation you'd want if you were building an airtight case. That's not a gap in the research. It's the design working exactly as intended decades later, on historians instead of the Gestapo. A weapon built to leave nothing behind doesn't suddenly start leaving records once the war it was built for ends. What survives is scattered mentions, veterans' accounts, the occasional gun turning up in a museum, or a cache with no clean chain of custody behind it, and a strong, recurring pattern suggesting this thing kept getting quietly issued to people whose job was to not be seen, in conflict after conflict, long after the engineer who built it had any say in where it went. Think about what that actually means for a piece of engineering. Most weapons from 1943 were obsolete by the 1960s, replaced the moment something faster or more powerful came along. This one kept getting handed to specialists for 50 straight years without a single serious attempt to redesign it. Nobody improved on it because there was nothing about its one job, silence at contact range, with nothing to trace, that needed improving. A pistol designed for one war ended up serving in most of the ones that followed it. And it did that so quietly that nobody can even give you an exact final count. What it left behind wasn't a body of evidence. It was a shape, a strange, tubular little idea about silence that other people would spend the rest of the century trying to copy. Here's where the story gets strange in a different way. A weapon designed to be forgotten the moment it was used didn't get forgotten. It got famous. Some of that fame has a name attached to it that everyone recognizes. Ian Fleming spent the war working in naval intelligence, moving in the same circles as the people running Station 9 and the handful of other SOE workshops scattered across the English countryside. When he sat down after the war to invent a fictional gadget master for his new spy novels, the department he built, Q Branch, the workshop that hands James Bond his exploding pen and his car full of tricks, was drawn straight from what he'd seen at places exactly like the Frythe. The well rod isn't the gun Bond carries on screen, but the idea of it, a plain, ugly object built by quiet engineers to do one impossible job discreetly, is the idea Fleming was writing from the very start. The real thing came first, and it was stranger and far less glamorous than the fiction it went on to inspire. Nobody at Station 9 was wearing a tuxedo. It's also today sitting behind glass. Surviving well rods are held in military and intelligence museum collections in Britain, cataloged now as some of the most requested artifacts from SOE's entire catalog of toys. Visitors lean in to look at the same smooth tube that was once designed specifically so nobody would look twice at it. A tube of metal that spent decades being handled exclusively by people who weren't supposed to be seen, now permanently on display for the opposite reason, with a placard explaining exactly what it was for. The design didn't stay locked in a display case either. In 2014, a Swiss firearms maker took the same core idea, a bolt-action pistol built entirely around an integral suppressor, and released a modern version with a name that sounds almost like a joke, the VP9, officially the veterinary pistol. On paper, it was marketed as a humane tool for putting down injured livestock in the field, a classification that let it slip through firearms regulations in several countries that would otherwise have blocked an ordinary suppressed handgun from ever reaching a civilian market. Underneath the paperwork, it was the well rod's own logic, updated 70 years later. Build the object and describe the object, so the wrong questions never get asked in the first place. It's since become something else entirely. A favorite among civilian collectors and suppressor enthusiasts who buy it for exactly what it actually is, not what the label filed with regulators says. The same company now sells a direct descendant under its own name, the Station 6, a title that's practically a signed confession of where the whole idea came from. So here's where all of it lands. Every decision in this design, going back to a wartime engineer handed an impossible brief, was built around one goal: disappear. No maker's mark, no slide to clatter, no paper trail, no second version of events for anyone to reconstruct afterward. A weapon so committed to vanishing that even its own government struggled to say exactly how many were built, or where they all ended up going, decades after the fact. And that same object is now one of the most recognizable, most talked about, most collected pieces of clandestine hardware to ever come out of the 20th century. Documentaries get made about it. Museums build exhibits around it. Collectors chase surviving examples for serious money. Modern companies put its name on their products as a selling point rather than a secret. The thing engineered harder than almost anything else in history to be forgotten is the thing nobody who learns about it forgets. Maybe that's not really a contradiction. Every gap in the record, the unmarked barrel, the numbers nobody can pin down, the mission still classified or simply never written down anywhere, is exactly what keeps people leaning in. A famous rifle with a complete paper trail is a fact. A quiet metal tube built specifically to make sure no complete paper trail could ever exist is a mystery. And mysteries are the one thing secrecy has never actually managed to bury. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the story of an object instead of the general standing next to it, this channel exists for exactly that, and there's another one already waiting for you. It was built to kill once and vanish without a trace. It did the first part perfectly. It's still working on the second.